اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Reciting dua nudba on our behalf, on behalf of the mu'mineen, all those who are present, all those who are in need of dua, and our families. Qurbatan ilallah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد نبيه وآله وسلم تسليما. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم لك الحمد على ما جرى به قضاؤك في أوليائك الذين استخلصتهم لنفسك ودينك، إذ اخترت لهم جزيل ما عندك من النعيم المقيم الذي لا زوال له ولا إثم حلال، بعد أن شردت عليهم الزهد في درجات هذه الدنيا الدنية وزخرفها وزبرجها، فشرتوا لك ذلك وعلمت منهم الوفاء به، فقبلتهم وقربتهم وقدمت لهم الذكر العلي والثناء الجلي، وأحببت عليهم ملائكتك وكرمتهم بوحيك ورفدتهم بعلمك، وجعلتهم الذريعة إليك والوسيلة إلى رضوانك، فبعض أسكنته جنتك إلى أن أخرجته منها، وبعض حملته في فلقك ونجيته ومن آمن معه من الهلكة برحمتك، وبعض اتخذته لنفسك خليلا وسألك لسان صدق في الآخرين فأجبته وجعلت ذلك عليا، وبعض كلمته من شجرة تكليما وجعلت له من أخيه ردءا ووزيرا، وبعض أولدته من غير أب وآتيته البينات وأيدته بروح القدس، وكل شرعت له شريعة ونهجت له منهاجا، وتخيرت له أوصياء مستحفظا بعد مستحفظ من مدة إلى مدة، إقامة لدينك وحجة على عبادك، ولئلا يزول الحق عن مقره ويغلب الباطل على أهله، ولا يقول أحد لولا أرسلت إلينا رسولا منذر وأقمت لنا علما هاديا فنتبع آياتك من قبل أن نضل ونخزى، إلى أن انتهيت بالأمر إلى حبيبك ونجيبك محمد صلى الله عليه وآله، فكان كما أنت جبته سيد من خلقته وصفوة من استفيته وأفضل من اجتبيته وأكرم من اعتمدته، قدمته على أنبيائك وبعثته إلى الثقلين من عبادك، وأوتعته مشاركك ومغاربك، وسخرت له البراق وعرجت بروحه إلى السماء، وأودعته علم ما كان وما يكون إلى انقضاء خلقك، ثم نصرته بالرعب وحففته بجبرائيل وميكائيل والمسومين من ملائكتك، ووعدته أن تظهر دينه على الدين كله ولو كره المشركون، وذلك بعد أن بوأته مبوع صدق من أهله، وجعلت له ولهم أول بيت مذع للناس للذي ببكة مباركة وهدى للعالمين، فيه آيات بينات مقام إبراهيم ومن دخله كان آمنا، وقلت إنما يريد الله ليذهب عنكم الرجس أهل البيت ويطهركم تطهيرا. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. ثم جعلت أجر محمد صلواتك عليه وآله مودتهم في كتابك، فقلت قل لا أسألكم عليه أجرا إلا المودة في القربى، وقلت ما سألتكم من أجر فهو لكم، وقلت ما أسألكم عليه من أجر إلا من شاء أن يتخذ إلى ربه سبيلا، فكانوا هم السبيل إليك والمسلك إلى رضوانك. فلما انقضت أيامه وأقام وليه علي بن أبي طالب صلواتك عليهما وآلهما هاديان، إذ كان هو المنذر ولكل قوم هاد، فقال والملأ أمامه من كنت مولاه فعلي مولاه، اللهم وال من والاه وعاد من عاداه، وانصر من نصره واخذل من خذله. وقال من كنت أنا نبيه فعلي أميره، وقال أنا وعلي من شجرة واحدة وسائر الناس من شجر شتى، وأحله محل هارون من موسى، فقال له أنت مني بمنزلة هارون من موسى، إلا أنه لا نبي بعدي. وزوجه ابنته سيدة النساء العالمين، وحل له من مسجده ما حل له، وسد الأبواب إلا بابه، ثم أودعه علمه وحكمته، فقال أنا مدينة العلم وعلي بابها، فمن أراد المدينة والحكمة فليأتها من بابها. ثم قال أنت أخي ووسيهي ووارثي، لحمك من لحمي ودمك من دمي، وسلمك سلمي وحربك حربي، والإيمان مخالة لحمك ودمك كما خالت لحمي ودمي، وأنت غدا على الحوض خليفتي، وأنت تقضي ديني وتنجز عداتي، وشيعتك على منابر من نور مبيضة وجوههم حولي في الجنة وهم جيراني، ولولا أنت يا علي لم يعرف المؤمنون بعدي، وكان بعده هدى من الضلال ونورا من العمى وحبل الله المتين وصراطه المستقيم، لا يسبق بقرابة في رحم ولا بسابقة في الدين، ولا يلحق في منقبة من مناقبه، يحذو حذو الرسول صلى الله عليهما وآلهما، ويقاتل على التأويل ولا تأخذه في الله لومة لائم، قد وتر فيه سناديد العرب وقتل أبطالهم وناوش ذؤبانهم، فأودع قلوبهم أحقادا بدرية وخيبرية وهنينية وغيرهن، فعذبت على عداوته وأكبت على منابضته، حتى قتل الناكثين والقاستين والمارقين. ولما قضى نحبه وقتله أشكى الآخرين يتبع أشكى الأولين، لم يمتثل أمر رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله في الهادين بعد الهادين، والأمة مصرة على مقته مجتمعة على قتيئة الرحم وإقصاء ولده إلا القليل ممن وفى لرعاية الحق فيهم، فقتل من قتل وسبي من سبي وأقصي من أقصي، وجرى القضاء لهم بما يرجى له حسن المثوبة، إذ كانت الأرض لله يورثها من يشاء من عباده، والعاقبة للمتقين. سبحان ربنا إن كان وعد ربنا لمفعولا، ولن يخلف الله وعده وهو العزيز الحكيم. فعلى الأطايب من أهل محمد وعلي صلى الله عليهما وآلهما فليبكي الباكون، وإياهم فليندب النادبون، ولمثلهم فلتذرف الدموع، وليصرخ الصارخون، ويضج الضاجون، ويعج العاجون. أين الحسن أين الحسين، أين أبناء الحسين، صالح بعد الصالح وصادق بعد الصادق، أين السبيل بعد السبيل، أين الخيرة بعد الخيرة، أين الشموس طالعة، أين الأقمار المنيرة، أين أنجم الزاهرة، أين أعلام الدين وقواعد العلم، أين بقية الله التي لا تخلو من العترة الهادية؟ أين المعد لقطع دابر الظلمة؟ أين المنتظر لإقامة الأمت والعوج؟ أين المرتجى لإزالة الجور والعدوان؟ أين المدخر لتجديد الفرائض والسنن؟ أين المتخير لإعادة الملة والشريعة؟ أين مؤمل لإحياء الكتاب وحدوده؟ أين محيي معالم الدين وأهله؟ أين قاسم الشوقة المعتدين؟ أين هادم أبنية الشرق والنفاق؟ أين مبيد أهل الفسوق والإسيان والطغيان؟ أين حاسد فروع الغي والشقاق؟ أين طامس آثار الزيغ والأهواء؟ أين قاطئ حبائل الكذب والافتراء؟ أين مبيد العتاة والمردى؟ أين المستأصل أهل العناد والتضليل والإلحاد؟ أين معز الأولياء ومضل الأعداء؟ أين جامع الكلمة على التقوى؟ أين باب الله الذي منه يؤتى؟ أين وجه الله الذي إليه يتوجه الأولياء؟ أين السبب المتصل بين الأرض والسماء؟ أين صاحب يوم الفتح وناشر الراية الهدى؟ أين مؤلف الشمل الصلاح والرضا؟ أين طالب بذهول الأنبياء وأبناء الأنبياء؟ أين طالب بدم المقتول بكربلاء؟ أين المنصور على من اعتدى عليه وافترى؟ أين المضطر الذي يجاب إذا دعا؟ أين صدر الخلائق ذو البر والتقوى؟ أين ابن النبي المصطفى وابن علي المرتضى وابن خديجة الغراء وابن فاطمة الكبرى؟ بأبي أنت وأمي ونفسي لك الوقاء والحمى، يا ابن السادة المقربين، يا ابن النجباء الأكرمين، يا ابن الهداة المهديين، يا ابن الخيرة المهذبين، يا ابن الغطارفة الأنجبين، يا ابن العطايب المطهرين، يا ابن الخضارمة المنتجبين، يا ابن القماقمة الأكرمين، يا ابن البدور المنيرة، يا ابن السرج المضيئة، يا ابن الشهب الثاقبة، يا ابن العنجم الزاهرة، يا ابن السبل الواضحة، يا ابن الأعلام اللائحة، يا ابن العلوم الكاملة، يا ابن السنن المشهورة، يا ابن المعالم المأثورة، يا ابن المعجزات الموجودة، يا ابن الدلائل المشهودة، يا ابن الصراط المستقيم، يا ابن النبأ العظيم، يا ابن من هو في أم الكتاب لدى الله علي حكيم، يا ابن الآيات والبينات، يا ابن الدلائل الظاهرات، يا ابن البراهين الواضحات الباهرات، يا ابن الحجج البالغات، يا ابن النعم السابغات، يا ابن طه والمحكمات، يا ابن ياسين والضاريات، يا ابن تور والعاديات، يا ابن من دنا فتدل فكان قاب قوسين أو أدنى دنوا واقترابا من العلي الأعلى. ليت شعري أين استقرت بك النوى، بل أي أرض تقلك أو ثرى، أبي رضوى أو غيرها أم ذي توى، عزيز علي أن أرى الخلق ولا ترى، ولا أسمع لك حسيسا ولا نجوى، عزيز علي أن تحيط بك دوني البلوى، ولا ينالك مني ذجيجا ولا شكوى، بنفسي أنت من مغيب لم يخلو منا، بنفسي أنت من نازح ما نزح عنا، بنفسي أنت أمنية الشائق يتمنى من مؤمن ومؤمنة ذكر فحنا، بنفسي أنت من عقيد إز لا يسامى، بنفسي أنت من أثيل مجد لا يجارى، بنفسي أنت من تلاد نعم لا تضاحى، بنفسي أنت من نسيف شرف لا يساوى. إلى متى أحار فيك يا مولاي، وإلى متى، وأي خطاب أسف فيك، وأي نجوى. عزيز علي أن أجاب دونك وأناغى، عزيز علي أن أبكيك ويخذلك الورى، عزيز علي أن يجري عليك دونهم ما جرى. هل من معين فأطيل معه العويل والبقاء، هل من جزوع فأساعد جزعه إذا خلا، هل قضيت عين فساعدتها عيني على القضاء، هل إليك يا ابن أحمد سبيل فتلقى، هل يتصل يومنا منك بعدة فنحظى، متى نرد مناهلك الروية فنروى، متى ننتقئ من عذب مائك فقد طال الصدى، متى نغاديك ونراوحك فنقر عينا، متى ترانا ونراك وقد نشرت اللواء النسر، ترانا نحف بك وأنت تؤم الملأ، وقد ملأت الأرض عدلا وأذقت أعداءك هوانا وإقابا، وأبرت العتاة وجحدت الحق وقطعت دابر المتكبرين، واجتثثت أصول الظالمين، ونحن نقول الحمد لله رب العالمين. اللهم أنت كشاف الكرب والبلوى، وإليك أستعدي فعندك العدوى، وأنت رب الآخرة والدنيا، فأغيث يا غياث المستغيثين عبيدك المبتلى، وأره سيده يا شديد القوى، وعزل عنه به الأسى والجوى، وبرد غليله يا من على العرش استوى، ومن إليه الرجعى والمنتهى. اللهم ونحن عبيدك الطائقون إلى وليك المذكر بك وبنبيك، خلقته لنا اسمة وملاذا، وأقمته لنا قواما ومعاذا، وجعلته للمؤمنين منا إماما، فبلغه منا تحية والسلاما، وزدنا بذلك يا رب إكراما، واجعل مستقره لنا مستقرا ومقاما، وأتمم نعمتك بتقديمك إياه أمامنا، حتى توردنا جنانك ومرافقة الشهداء من خلسائك. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد، وصل على محمد جده ورسولك سيد الأكبر، وعلى أبيه سيد الأصغر، وجدته الصديقة الكبرى فاطمة بنت محمد صلى الله عليه وآله، وعلى من استفيت من آبائه البررة، وعليه أفضل وأكمل وأتم وأدوم وأكثر وأوفر ما صليت على أحد من أسفيائك وخيرتك من خلقك. وصل عليه صلاة لا غاية لعددها، ولا نهاية لمددها، ولا نفاد لأمدها. اللهم وأقم به الحق، وأدحض به الباطل، وعدل به أولياءك، واذلل به أعداءك. وصل اللهم بيننا وبينه وصلة تؤدي إلى مرافقة السلفه، واجعلنا ممن يأخذ بحجزتهم ويمكث في ذلهم، وأعنا على تأدية حقوقه إليه والاجتهاد في طاعته واجتناب معصيته، وامنن علينا برضاه، وهب لنا رأفته ورحمته ودعاءه وخيره ما ننال به سعة من رحمتك وفوزا عندك، واجعل صلاتنا به مقبولة وذنوبنا به مغفورة، ودعاءنا به مستجاب، واجعل أرزاقنا به مبسوطة، وهمومنا به مقفية، وحوائجنا به مقضية. واقبل إلينا بوجهك الكريم، واقبل تقربنا إليك، وانظر إلينا نظرة رحيمة نستكمل بها الكرامة عندك، ثم لا تسرفها عنا بجودك. واسقنا من حوض جده صلى الله عليه وآله بكأسه وبيده ريان رويا هنيئا سائغا لا ظمأ بعده يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. It's mustahab to recite 2 rakat salat, dua al-nudba, qurbatan ila Allah. بسم الله الرحمن بسم الله الرحمن بسم الله الرحمن بسم الله الرحمن اللهم صل على الله. بسم الله. وأشهد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. السلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Do we have someone? Yeah. Bismillah. This mic here is good. Turn it around for you. Timer's up. Yeah, timer's 12:44. We're right open. How are you, Reese?
لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله توكلت على الحي الذي لا يموت والحمد لله الذي لم يتخذ صاحبة ولا ولدا ولم يكن له شريك في الملك ولم يكن له ولي من الذل وكبره تكبيرا سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله والله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله
اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد
أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله أشهد أن أمير المؤمنين علي ولي الله صلوات الله وسلامه عليه أشهد أن أمير المؤمنين علي ولي الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح حي على خير الأعمال حي على خير الأعمال الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله وصلى الله على سيدنا سيدنا ونبينا محمد وآله وسلم اللهم اجعل ببارك ورسيدنا وأجعل عند قبر رسولك صلى الله عليه مستقر وقرارا صلوات محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، ثم الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين، واللعنة على أعدائهم أجمعين من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين. أما بعد. Respected elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My congratulations to you today on the day of Friday, the day of Eid for the Mu'mineen, especially in these auspicious days where we are celebrating the days of celebration of our Holy Prophet Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Anyone else notice the women's hall always looks better than ours? We've been continuing our discussion around Surah Al-Qalam, the 68th chapter of the Holy Quran, and we've reached the 14th verse, in which there is admonishments being issued to Walid ibn Mughira, and Allah continues His address towards this personality and explaining his status. And we talked about last week where Allah finished His conversation by referring to him as Utullin ba'da dhalika zanim, callous, and on top of that, base of birth. This discussion, Allah continues in the next verse, in the 14th verse, which brings an interesting structure to the conversation that is open to discussion. In the 14th verse, Allah says, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, An kana dha malim wa banin. The literal translation of this comes to the explanation of saying, one who he is one because he has wealth and children. Dha malim wa banin. The question comes when Allah makes a statement like this is, what is the context of the statement? There are three possible interpretations that are given for this statement, if not more so. That the first says that An kana dha malim wa banin is in connection to the previous verses. That Allah is describing all of the negative qualities that this person possesses. For example, Utullin ba'da dhalika zanim. Why does he behave in such a negative manner? He behaves in such a manner because he thinks himself to be in success because he possesses wealth and children. A second interpretation implies, and some translators have taken this interpretation to say, that do not behave like him or think him to be a role model because he possesses wealth and children. An kana dha malin wa banin, that he is like this, or don't look at him as an example because he possesses. Now literally, that's not how we would look at the Arabic language as being translated literally. However, the context of if this is an independent statement, and if it's not attached to the previous conversation, it would be a good discussion to have, that Allah is demonstrating that what causes someone to possess such negative characteristics and believe that they are above receiving punishment for their negative behavior. That one, for example, who looks at his success in the world, looks at his wealth in this world, looks at his children in this world, imagines and thinks that his character is justified. That I'm okay because Allah has given me these things, so I must be doing okay and I must be alright because I have possession of all these items and this wealth. In this context, we take a look and we see that this meaning may have some benefit in understanding it, where the interpretation is to say that Allah is saying, may it never come that you follow him, this Walid ibn Mughira, or anyone who possesses these negative characteristics, owing to his affluence and offspring. That affluence and offspring for us as a community should not be a measure for who do we follow and who do we look up to. When we look at today in contemporary society, this is a very common practice where we see articles written about 10 successful habits of 10 millionaires or billionaires, or what a billionaire does every morning. Here Allah is giving the instruction saying, don't overlook the morality of an individual on the basis of the wealth that they possess. That the morality that they possess is a much greater characteristic to look at when looking for character. The third possible interpretation of this verse In kana dha malin wa banin, is, for example, a tie to the next verse. That Allah is saying, is it because you possess this wealth and this children that you behave in a negative fashion? And the negative fashion that Allah is discussing comes in the following verse of describing the behavior of this walid and people who possess this wealth. So the 15th verse, Allah makes the statement, إِذَا تُتْلَى عَلَيْهِ آيَاتُنَا قَالَ أَسَاطِيرُ الْأَوَّلِينَ. That when the verses of the Quran are recited to him, and when our signs are given to him and recited to him, he says, Asatirul Awwalin, myths of the ancients. That you say myths of the ancients and disregard everything that came in history that we explained to you because you possess wealth and children. So this third interpretation also holds value for us to try and understand what Allah's intention was, and the Mufassirin have taken various positions amongst these three statements to give us an explanation of the intention of Allah. Now, the reason that this becomes an interesting conversation is that when we take a look at a translation is an interpretation of the opinion of the author of what Allah is actually saying. The translator is not sure of what Allah's meaning was in this verse. That when Allah makes this verse, is He tying it to the previous verses? Is it an independent statement on its own? Is it tied to the following verses? And the translator comes to the conclusion that I think this is what was intended in this position. Which is why sometimes when we look at some of the specialities of the Quran, we say the speciality of the Quran is restricted to the Arabic language. For example, while it's always good to sit with wudu with any version of the Quran, the wujub of not touching the words without wudu only fits for the Arabic. Because the Arabic encompasses the exact and entire meaning of what Allah intends, and the translator is bringing his own interpretation to the meaning of what Allah intends. This is also another reason why it's not a bad thing to comparatively look at different translations, to understand and see what are the different positions on the verse that we may otherwise be missing. So by looking at these different translations, we can try and get a more encompassing meaning of what was intended. And this is why, for example, there exists the science of exegesis or tafsir. The science of exegesis or tafsir, if you notice, changes and comes to new conclusions upon the meaning of the Quran as generations change, which is why roughly in every generation a new tafsir of the Quran is written to present the interpretation and explanation of how we understand the Quran in this time. This isn't an unusual thing, this isn't a bad thing. Rather, when we see the statements of the Ahlul Bayt and the Holy Prophet Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad, inna likulli harfi al-Qur'ani sab'ina butun, madmun al-riwayah. That in general, the hadith explains and says that every letter of the Qur'an can have 70 different meanings under it. So the combination and understanding of these meanings comes as we go through different processes of social education that we come back and we reapply it to the Quran to learn and understand a different explanation. Which is why in the contemporary structure in the past 40 years, one of the new, not new in terms of, one of the structured discussions that has happened has been tafsir al-mawdu'i. That instead of taking a look at the Quran from Surah Fatiha to Surah Nas, one verse at a time, there's an extrapolation by topic of all of the verses throughout the Quran that relate to a topic and looking at them collectively in one discussion to see the correlation between them as opposed to simply looking at their position in the middle of a surah. And different interpretations can be made about the context of what Allah is discussing. Which is why verses like this are always a reminder to us that there is much that Allah has kept secret from us, even if we can understand what it is being said, the why and the how and the context is something that is reserved for Allah at points in time. Verse number 15, where Allah makes a statement, إِذَا تُتْلَى عَلَيْهِ آيَاتُنَا قَالَ أَسَاطِيرُ الْأَوَّلِينَ. When our signs are recited to him, he says, myths of the ancients. This practice is a warning that Allah is giving to us, that this attribute, these negative attributes that were possessed by Walid ibn Mughira, the consequence of these negative attributes, if one was to say, so what if one possesses one bad quality? The rest of them is good. Allah is now explaining and giving an explanation of what is the conclusion of those bad qualities. That those bad qualities that we possess, if we don't work on them, we will go to the process of denying the actual message of Allah. And this is exactly what Walid ibn Mughira is being is being told that this was his practice. That Walid was someone who, when Allah would give the explanation of what happened in previous nations, he would come to the conclusion and say that these are myths and lies, stories that you've come up with. We see this practice similarly happening today in the disillusionment of society and the self-righteousness and narcissism of contemporary Western society.
That when we look at, for example, the explanations of the Quran or the Bible or the Torah, people will look at them and say that these are stories that were made up. These were lies that were told or discussions that were told to keep people afraid without looking at the reality of what was being said. Allah here is warning against this attribute and saying that this is a sign of disbelief when you disbelieve in the Quran. We look and we see today that there are debates and discussions that happen which are negative discussions that talk about the idea that what we know about this world is actually not true. Whether we take a look and we see the people of Lut alayhi salam, that the people of Lut now, there's a contemporary discussion that says, yes, the people of Lut received Allah's punishment, but not for the indecency that they committed, but rather because they were thieves and robbers. How did they come to that conclusion when the Quran is very clear in this discussion? They've misinterpreted it intentionally and on purpose to belie the reality of the evilness of the sins that were being talked about in the people of Lut. When we see attributes like these, it should be a warning for us that this is a person who has stepped away from accepting the reality and the command of Allah and decided that his ego is a priority over the command of Allah. How? It's when I start to believe that what I know and I understand is more complete than the word of Allah. I've now lost trust in the word of Allah, that the word of Allah is absolute and true. And rather what's absolute and true is my interpretation and understanding. This aspect is a very dangerous point, that when we come to a point in comparing our opinion, our understanding to the Quran, and we give priority to our opinion as opposed to giving priority to the Quran, we've made a mistake. We've gone down the wrong path. It should be, and it happens naturally, the same way as we're discussing in verse number 14, that there are things and concepts that Allah discusses in the Quran that are beyond my comprehension and understanding. Instead of trying to simplify them so that I can understand them and I can encompass the meaning, the right and responsibility of the mu'min is to believe in the absolute truth of the Quran, whether I can understand it or not. And when I can't understand it, to ask for Allah's assistance and guidance to come to the correct conclusions and complete conclusions of the Quran. So here in this verse, when Allah gives the explanation, إِذَا تُتْلَى عَلَيْهِ آيَاتُنَا قَالَ أَسَاطِيرُ الْأَوَّلِينَ, that these are the myths of the ancients when they hear the verses of the Quran, that these are stories that were made up to frighten people. The Quran does not tell stories, it teaches lessons. The Quran does not make up fiction, rather it speaks of facts. And if I cannot comprehend the facts, it does not mean that I belie the Quran, but rather that I wait and I do my research and I learn what the intention of the Quran was. In verse number 16, Allah now explains the consequence of this behavior and He starts the conversation. سَنَسِمُهُ عَلَى الْخُرْطُومِ, and we shall soon brand him on his snout. There are a few different interpretations to the meaning of this verse. سَنَسِمُهُ عَلَى الْخُرْطُومِ, that we shall brand him عَلَى الْخُرْطُومِ. The literal translation of khurtum is snout, and typically refers to one of two animals, the elephant or the pig. And it's something that is an exaggerated nose that is present, and it's an explanation of showing that, for example, that this term within itself is intended to have not necessarily a derogatory meaning, but a meaning that shows the lowliness of the individual that he's being talked about, that he is no better than an animal, that he should be seen in this way. One explanation of this points back to the discussion around Walid ibn Mughira, where Allah is doing a foretelling of what is coming forward for Walid. Walid participated in the battle of Badr, and when he fought in the battle of Badr, he was actually struck on his nose, and a prominent mark was left on his face from the battle of Badr until the time that he died. So when Allah makes the statement, سَنَسِمُهُ, this scene is sofa, is discussing a future tense that soon in the nearby future, this one will be branded and marked upon his face for the behavior that he had. This explanation about Walid is one of the interpretations that shortly after the battle of Badr, that Allah also had him marked until the moment that he died. The second explanation talks about Walid and those of similar character, that they will be raised on the day of judgment with a branding and a mark on their face that cannot be hidden from their face, about the fact that these will be the denizens of the fire of hell. That this sanasimuhu, this scene of the future tense, is referring to the day of judgment, and that on the day of judgment, those who were the enemies of Ahlul Bayt, those who possessed these negative characteristics that are being discussed, those who denied and belied the Quran, they will be the ones who will be raised on that day, brandishing the mark of hell, and it will be made across their nose. This discussion about why the nose has two structures in it. One is the apparent nature that the nose is the most prominent feature upon the face, that once it is upon the face on the nose, it can't be hidden. That it's something that is clear and in the center of the face and you can't get away from it, and a person is recognized by their face. The second is a context clue of the culture of Arabia. That the description or the prominence of a person could be described by their nose in the Arab culture. Now this opens a larger question about the structure of how much acknowledgement the Arab culture was given in the religion of Islam. Let me give you an explanation. There are some times that we talk about, for example, attributes of the religion of Islam that pre-existed the time of Islam. For example, the names of the months in Islam, Muharram, Safar, Rabiul Awwal, Rabiul Akhir, are not names that were assigned after the advent of Islam, but rather were names that pre-existed before Islam, and Islam simply took them and made them a doctrinal part of how we explain and understand the months. Now, the question that comes is this now then saying that whatever was done by the Arab before was correct? No. It is in no way a structure of saying, yes, that this is right and that is wrong, or this was good and this was bad. Rather, what it does is it allows things to exist that already existed. You see, in Islam, there are three ways that when Islam was established, how it dealt with what existed before. It either, one, said that whatever they were doing before was okay and it's fine. For example, the names of the months that were established before, it continued on with them and it said it's fine. The buying and selling that was done in the markets was fine. The contracts that were written amongst people was okay. And Islam simply allowed them to continue. It did not say this is the only way to do it or this is the absolute right way to do it, but said it's permissible. The second thing is that Islam completely outlawed it. For example, the sale of pork and alcohol was completely outlawed. The use of, for example, interest, riba, was completely outlawed. It took something that existed before and threw it away entirely. And the third is that it was between one condition and another that it allowed some aspects of it and forbade other aspects. Prominent examples of this, for example, is where we talk about halallahu al-bay'. Allah has made selling and buying permissible. Wa harrama al-riba, and has made riba and interest impermissible. One thing Allah allowed entirely, however it was existing, Allah said, whatever you have been buying and selling, no problem, it's fine. Other things that people were doing in the past, Allah completely forbade. The third category is sometimes described as saying this, that some of these things were allowed and then they were forbidden. For example, in the Arab, there was a tradition where a son could marry the widows of his father. Well, what happened is that if a man was married to multiple women and one of them gave him a son, when he died, that son, not his mother, but the other women that his father was married to, would marry them as well. Islam allowed the continuation of marriage, but forbade this aspect of marriage. In this way, we see that some of the attributes of the Arab culture that were allowed were continued and others were removed entirely. Now when we look at this verse where Allah is saying, and He gives the explanation that سَنَسِمُهُ عَلَى الْخُرْطُومِ, the use of the term khurtum and the use of the description of nose is keeping with the linguistic practice of the Arab. That the Arab used to use the nose as a description of prominence in someone's face and describe certain attributes or use it as a description to talk about a person. For example, شَمَخَ فُلَانٌ بِأَنَفِهِ. The literal translation, so and so is smelled by his nose. But the instruction was, as someone who is recognized by the shape or features of their face and features of their nose, was one of the ways that they would use this language. وَأَرْغَمَ اللَّهُ أَنَفَهُ, and God forced his nose into the affair, was a common Arab phrase that was used at that point in time, which, for example, was the literal translation of God forced him by his nose or forced his nose into the matter. We may, for example, use this contemporarily in our English language as he stuck his nose in it. That it was an affair that he got caught up in. So we too have this practice as well too. Another way that we see that the Arab had a description of why the nose was given of prominence was, for example, وَحَمِيَ فُلَانَ أَنَفَهُ, and that he protected his nose. He kept his nose safe from the affair. He kept himself safe from the affair. The use of the nose as a description of prominence, that by describing the nose we describe the entire person, is where Allah is using it as well too. سَنَسِمُهُ عَلَى الْخُرْطُومِ is a discussion that describes and says that the prominence of the nose and being marked on the nose was an indication that this was a denizen of hell, and this is how Allah will make distinctions amongst the people of that time. And then to use a term like khurtum for the nose was a description of saying that this was someone who was a derided individual and a lowly individual. The language and beauty of the Quran and the significance of this conversation and some of these conversations is to show the beauty of the Quran and to show how Allah has selected language that was both appropriate for that time and a reflection of the values of people and humanity collectively. That Allah has used beauty in His Quran, and the more time we spend with it, the more we can understand the delicacy and intricacy that the Quran is not just a generic book that speaks in general, but rather takes a look at the details of humanity and our nature and our culture and addresses them in their entirety. Verse number 18 continues, وَلَا يَسْتَثْنُ. Verse number 17 we haven't gotten to yet. Verse number 17 now starts a new conversation, where Allah, after had talking about the negative characteristics of Walid, his misbehavior, the consequences of his actions, now Allah uses this to draw a parable that this is not the first time I'm having this conversation and that punishment will be issued to a people. Allah begins in verse number 17 a new story and discussion that will start this week and continue next week. إِنَّا بَلَوْنَاهُمْ كَمَا بَلَوْنَا أَصْحَابَ الْجَنَّةِ إِذْ أَقْسَمُوا لَيَسْرِمُنَّهَا مُصْبِحِينَ. Allah in this verse begins a conversation. Indeed, we have tested them, just as we tested the people of the garden when they vowed they would gather its fruit at dawn. This story, we've actually discussed it in a Thursday night in the past as well too, but this story is something that was a common parable and story that was known by all of people at that time, which is why Allah draws an allusion to it but doesn't tell all the details of the story, because it was something that was commonly known and something that was understood by the people, that it was a lesson that people had been learned and a parable that was told quite often. Same way we have parables in our time, this was a parable of that time. The story talks about an old man who lived in a town that is referred to be in the country of Yemen. Now, some Mufassirin have gone to different countries in different places, but the most common explanation is that there used to be, this story is about a town and a villager in the country of Yemen who lived in a town called Sarwan. Sarwan is about 12 to 15 miles from the city of Sana'a in Yemen, and in this village there happened to be an old man who possessed gardens that would produce a great amount of fruit. The practice of this man was that every year when his fruit would give its produce, when his garden would give its produce, he would take out a little bit for his needs and give the rest away in charity. And that this became his practice of his life. When he passed away, he had at least 3 sons. And these 3 sons came to the conclusion that now that our father has died, our expenses and needs are greater than our father, and we can't justify giving any poor people anything because we ourselves have needs and desires that have to be fulfilled. So Allah explains and tells the story, and He says the example of how we tested these people is like how we tested those sons after their father had died. إِذَا أَقْسَمُوا لَيَسْرِمُنَّهَا مُصْبِحِينَ. That when these sons had sworn that they would gather its fruit at dawn, that they made the decision after their father died. The produce that year was excessive and great that was collected by the garden, and they looked at their father's garden and they decided that all of this money that's coming in, we need it more than anyone else. And they made the promise that in the morning we will collect this before any beggar or any person who comes to receive wealth and sustenance from here gets anything. We'll take everything and we'll leave, and no one will know what happened. The story continues and Allah describes it. The next verse is very interesting, where it says, وَلَا يَسْتَثْنُونَ, and they made no exception. This interpretation or this statement, وَلَا يَسْتَثْنُونَ, that they did not make any exception, has 2 significant discussions in the tafsir of Quran. One points to the fact that when the sons made the decision that we're going to take everything for ourselves, and they made no exception that anyone else would get a share, that Allah is saying, وَلَا يَسْتَثْنُونَ, that they decided that no other person shall have any share. Where their father's practice was to give everything except the essentials away, these boys said, we take everything without exception and leave nothing to anyone else. The second one is very interesting, that in Tafsir Majma' al-Bayan, the author doesn't point to this at all. He says, وَلَا يَسْتَثْنُونَ is a reference and a discussion to the idea that they did not leave any permission for the position of Allah in this conversation. So for example, it's explained, أي غير مستثنين في الإيمانهم فلم يقولوا إن شاء الله فإن قول القائل لأفعلن كذا إلى أن يشاء الله استثناء ومعناه إلا أن يشاء الله منعي أو تمكين مانعي. The Mufassir, he gives an explanation. He says, when Allah says they made no exception, it has nothing to do with the idea that they made no exception that they would give some fruit to anyone else or any produce from their garden to anyone else. It refers to the intention that they made. And what was their intention? That they left no place for Allah even in their intention. That it is the obligation that a person should say and make an exception to their statement that I intend to do this unless if Allah intends something else. They left no place for Allah in their statement. Which is why the explanation that the Mufassir comes to is he gives the explanation, he says anything that you desire to do, always leave room for exception that Allah may want something else from you. That I intend to go do this project, insha'Allah. That with my intention is the exception that Allah may want something else from me. This idea of leaving space for an exception and how the Qur'an's discussion, وَلَا يَسْتَثْنُونَ, as a general concept for us is very important. When we hear this story, and inshallah we'll continue with this story next week to see what happens to the boys and what happens to their aspect of wanting to keep all of their wealth for themselves, that they decided that Allah has no position in their lives. What was the greater action that they performed? One, to intend that they would take care of their families as a priority, or two, that they neglected to consider that Allah has a presence and position in their decisions. If we look at option number two, we understand the Mufassir of Majma' al-Bayan giving this explanation that always leave room for exception that Allah can change your irada and can change your decision, and that it is the desire of Allah that is necessary for something to come to fruition and conclusion. Never be absolute that I possess the ability to execute something entirely if Allah does not permit me to. That in our attributes, one of the important statements to keep in mind is that insha'Allah should accompany every one of our intentions. To understand this, we see a hadith from our sixth Imam, Ja'far as-Sadiq alayhi salam, explaining the significance of the statement of insha'Allah. Someone comes to the Imam and asks him, Yabna Rasulullah, is the knowledge of Allah and the will of Allah the same thing? That Allah knowing something, is it the same thing as Him making it happen? And the Imam replies that no, there is a difference between the knowledge of Allah and the will of Allah. Think about when, and the Imam says, think about it, he says, consider when you say insha'Allah and you don't say a'lam Allah. Allah knows I will do this. In our own words, the Imam says, if Allah wills are proof that Allah has not yet willed it. The statement of insha'Allah means that Allah has not yet forced it to come about, though it is not outside of Allah's knowledge. Meaning Allah knows all of the different things that could be happening, but He has not yet insisted that one should happen. Therefore, when I make an intention, it exists within the will of Allah, within the knowledge of Allah, and to bring Allah's will upon it to execute that idea, I should ask Allah as a dua to help me come to that conclusion. This aspect where the Imam is teaching is he's explaining and saying that the dictate of Allah has not been set. Your dua can change the dictate of Allah, therefore never try to make a decision without Allah being involved in our decisions. And that this is an important concept to remember, that everything is within the knowledge of Allah. It's true. And sometimes it happens. When we want something, it doesn't come true. What do we say? Allah didn't want it to happen. The question is, did you ask Allah to make your desire to come true? If we didn't, then we are being unfair to Allah that we didn't ask, and then how can we expect Him to give to us? So this explanation of وَلَا يَسْتَثْنُونَ, the immediate application to us is that always ensure that you leave room for exception, that Allah may will for this item to come about, and Allah may will to keep this item away from me. And I want Allah's will involved in my decisions. We ask Allah again by the rights of this day, by the rights of the Hadirin Ghaibin, that, oh Allah, first and foremost, forgive our sins, cover our flaws. Oh Allah, by the right of the day of Friday, by the right of the mention of Ahlul Bayt, fulfill our hajat. Oh Allah, those amongst our families and our communities that are suffering through sickness and disease, Ya Allah, give shafa'at to the mu'mineen wherever they are. Oh Allah, keep our families on the upright religion of Islam. Oh Allah, hasten the reappearance of Sahib al-Zaman. Make us and our families from the upright supporters of Sahib al-Zaman. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wal asr, innal insana lafi khusr. Illa alladhina amanu wa amilu s-salihat. Wa tawasu bil-haqqi wa tawasu bis-sabr. Sadaqallahu al-aliyyul adhim.
على
وآل محمد.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، ثم الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل وسلم على أمير المؤمنين علي بن أبي طالب وفاطمة الزهراء سيدة النساء العالمين، والحسن والحسين سيد شباب أهل الجنة، وعلي بن الحسين زين العابدين، ومحمد بن علي باقر وعلم النبيين، وجعفر بن محمد الصادق، وموسى بن جعفر الكاظم، وعلي بن موسى الرضا، ومحمد بن علي الجواد، وعلي بن محمد الهادي، والحسن بن علي الأسكري، وحجة الله يا ابن الحسن يا صاحب العصر والزمان. عجل الله تعالى فرجه وسهل الله تعالى مخرجه وظهوره، وجعلنا من أعوانه والأنصاره والمستشهدين بين يديه. اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات الأحياء منهم والأموات، تابع بيننا وبينهم بالخيرات، إنك مجيب الدعوات، إنك على كل شيء قدير. أوصيكم ونفسي بتقوى الله, enjoin upon you and myself to have fear and piety of Allah. Briefly in our discussion, very briefly actually, unfortunately due to time, as time keeps moving earlier for Salat al-Jum'ah, 3/4 of the year is over. September's ending. Made it through 3/4 of the year. This is a really important time for us as we look at the balance of this year that's left and only 3 months ahead of us, is to take account of ourselves, to take account of what we've accomplished this year, what is pending from us this year, what are the promises and commitments we've made to accomplish in this year, and what do we have to still fulfill. In our busy day-to-day life, sometimes we don't even realize the passage of time in relationship to our obligations to Allah. For example, sometimes we have qada, we have wajibat, whether it's from the month of Ramadan, whether it's a prayer, whether it's some action that we promise to commit, and we think I'll get to it at some point in time. And time keeps passing and goes away from us. As these days get shorter, it's a great time to catch up if I have fasts missing, if I have obligations to complete. These are days in which we should pay attention to ensure that as we close out this year, we've made some progress. We've become a better person. We've changed. It's important to ask ourselves, this year, what's a good deed I've done this year that I haven't done before? Or something unique I wanted to accomplish in my ibadat and character that I didn't do before? Is there something that I've done that I need to seek forgiveness for, that time is passing by and I haven't taken the time to properly seek Allah's forgiveness and repented for my actions and my behavior yet? Is there something new that I've learned this year? How am I developing as a human being? What in me is changing and becoming better? Am I better than I was last year at this time? Have I changed for the positive? Have I done anything for myself? We do this as a regular practice when it comes to our finances and our wealth. We take a look at our wealth, and whether we take a look at it in a professional environment where every quarter, every month there's a review and analysis of how was our performance this year versus last year, this year versus this month versus last month, this quarter versus previous quarter. All of these become analytical points to see the progress and development of us on a professional level or a financial level. But are we taking the time as we've completed 3/4 of this year to look at myself personally and see, who am I as a person? Am I a better person? Am I someone who does good things? Am I someone who has accomplished anything? What is it that I'm exceptionally proud of in this year before this year ends? How many books have I read? What new have I learned? What behavior has changed? Have I memorized or learned anything new from the Quran? Have I read the Quran? How many times did I finish the Quran this year? These are all valid questions to take a look at myself and a measure. This attribute of measuring ourselves and discussing ourselves and working on developing new practices is not something that we're arguing about. Rather, we talk about this all the time when we see, for example, the discussion between our fourth Imam Ali ibn al-Husayn Zain al-Abidin alayhi salam and his son, where he says, "O Baqir, bring to me such and such paper from such and such location." And Imam Baqir says, in that night, I had seen my father do worship he had never done before. The significance of that statement is the Imam, the Ma'soom, the perfect one, was not satisfied with what he did day after day. He was working on self-progression and improvement and growing in his faith and his ideology and spirituality. If the Imam is doing that practice, what's missing from our lives? Are we taking account? Are we taking advantage of this opportunity? And literally, we're at the end of this month. 3/4 of the year, it went by like this. I mean, at least for me, I'm sure you guys are in the same boat. But the idea of taking account is a central concept to the religion of Islam. We take a look and we see that our Prophet, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, repeated the statement, حاسبوا أنفسكم قبل أن تحاسبوا وزنوها قبل أن توازنوا وتجهزوا لعرض الأكبر. The Prophet will make the statement, he says, take account of yourselves and prepare yourself before you are held to account. And then evaluate yourself before someone else is responsible for evaluating you. And prepare yourselves for the great exposure. When the Prophet says, لِعَرَضِ الْأَكْبَرِ, this great exposure, is that at this point in time, the only one who knows, am I better or worse today than yesterday, is me. The only one who knows, am I a more pious person now than I was before, is you. No one else can judge you for that. But there is a day where Allah promises that He will expose every single one of us, and exactly what we possess will be known to humanity and society. That there will be no hiding this affair on the Day of Judgment. So if there's a day coming where society will know my accounts, will know what I possess, will know every goodness that I have and every bad thing that I've done, this is why the Prophet is saying, take account now. Go through the process now of preparing yourself for this process of taking account. We see, for example, the statements of Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. خذوا من أجسادكم تجودوا بها على أنفسكم وأسعوا في فكاك رقابكم قبل أن تغلق رهائنها. The Imam is making this statement. He's saying the purpose of this taking account is that take from your bodies and your material possessions and bestow it generously upon your souls, and strive to free yourselves from punishment before your ability to ransom and save yourselves is blocked. This statement, the purpose of this taking account right now, is that at this point in time I can exert physical effort and I can take from my material possession and transfer it to the hereafter. I can protect myself on the Day of Judgment. I can change my condition. I can seek forgiveness. But the Imam is explaining that there will come a point in time where your ability to ransom and save yourself will be stopped. And that moment where that stops is the moment of death. That as soon as the moment of death comes upon us, our ability to change our future, to increase in our good deeds, to seek forgiveness for our sins, is all entirely lost. And the same way as days of this year pass and this year passes, so do our lifespans. We don't know when our death is coming. I can't tell you if you're old or young, because I don't know when you're going to die. So that's a responsibility, that assume that this is the end of my time and prepare now before it's too late to make this preparation. So the same way, 3 months in the year is a good amount of time to accomplish something that we can say, I did something with this year. So the same way I want to take account of this year and make sure that I accomplish something in it, the same way I want to take a look at my life and prepare that I will have to answer for my actions on a day. We ask Allah again, by the right of this day, by the right of the Hadireen and Ghaibeen, that, oh Allah, first and foremost, forgive our sins, cover our flaws. Oh Allah, keep us and our families in the upright religion of Islam. Ya Allah, those mu'mineen who are suffering around the world, Ya Allah, give aman to the mu'mineen wherever they happen to be. Oh Allah, hasten the reappearance of Sahib al-Zaman. Make us and our families from his upright supporters, and entitle us to the ziyarat of Imam Hussein in this world, and the shifa of Imam Hussein in akhirah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Inna Allah ya'muru bil-adli wal-ihsani wa ita'i dhil qurba wa yanha 'anil fahsha'i wal-munkar wal-baghi ya'idhukum la'allakum tadhakkarun. Sadaqallahu al-aliyyul azim.
محمد وآل محمد